We've watched MG do electric sports cars, award-winning electric hatchbacks, surprisingly good family SUVs. But now the question is, can they hit where it hurts most in the hotly contested B-segment saloon category with this, the MG5? Now, as I mentioned earlier, the MG5 is a B-segment saloon, which means that it dukes it out against vehicles like the Toyota Vios and the Honda City. Powering this bright yellow thing is a 1.5-litre naturally aspirated 4-cylinder petrol engine up front, producing 115 PS and about 150 Newton meters of torque. That power goes to the front wheels via a CVT automatic gearbox with 7 virtual ratios. Now, that might seem particularly lackluster, particularly given the fact the Honda City produces more power, and for broadly the same money you can get into a turbocharged Proton S70. However, MG is banking on the fact that this is a time-tested powertrain, therefore one that is tuned to deliver reliability and efficiency. Even without this striking yellow paintwork, there is no denying the fact the MG5 certainly looks a lot bolder than a lot of other vehicles within the segment, where the Proton S70, for example, erred on the side of conservatism, and both the Honda City and the Toyota Vios have taken relatively familiar shape through the generations. The MG5 looks like a breath of fresh air. Up front, you have this enormous grille, something that they call the electric flame, at least that explains the design within, with an enormous MG badge up front. And that is set within this contrasting piece of plastic work along the front bumper, which stretches all the way to the furthest edges, where you will find functional air breathers down the side in order to improve aerodynamics. There's even a little bit of faux carbon fiber on the furthest lips of the front bumper, which I think looks very distinctive, and overall it certainly makes this car look pretty good. Above those, you will find a set of full LED headlights replete with LED indicators and LED daytime running lights, and beyond that, that's where you find one of this car's slightly weaker points, which are the wheels. Now, while the design certainly looks interesting with a dual tone finish replete with this sort of 3D effect knurling pattern on the wheels themselves, which again look distinctive, the problem that I have is the fact that they do look a little bit small. The MG5 is larger than both the Vios and the City, and therefore it does do some work towards making these wheels look relatively small. And it also doesn't help that they are wrapped in Maxxis Premitra tires, which are not great. Now, MG calls this a B-segment saloon, again pitting it against the Vios and the City. However, in terms of the overall dimensions, the MG5 is actually more of a C-segment saloon in hiding, because in terms of its overall dimensions, this car is not that far off what you'd get from a Honda Civic or indeed a Toyota Corolla. In fact, even the wheelbase is broadly similar. However, the overall body of this car is slightly narrower than your typical C-segment saloons, which is why the interior space also reflects that. But I think it's from this view where you see, again, one of this car's weakest points, but also one of its strongest points. The weakest points being those wheels that I mentioned earlier, but one of the strongest points has to be this car's fastback-like design. Because it has a slightly longer wheelbase compared to, again, the Toyota and the Honda, it does mean that this roofline has a little bit more metalwork in order to curve gently down towards this relatively short rear end. And it also means that the bodywork down the side has also been sculpted in such a way as to highlight this car's muscularity, which is why you get this curve up here, for example, as well as more indentations sort of around the wheel arches. Now, one of the things I would like to point out is that even though this car does not have a touch type keyless entry system, it does use a button. At least the button on both sides are body colored, which is something that clearly even Proton doesn't fully understand. Other features down the side include this nice piece of chrome trim, which again helps to highlight this car's overall design. I do think that it does look decently good from here, but I think it's actually this car's back end which looks the best, because that sloping roofline and that sculpted side moves into this very pert rear end with LED taillights replete with LED running guides, but bulb type indicators and reverse lights, and of course you get the fog light down there. Now, because the rear end of this car is quite sculpted and it sits quite low, it does mean there isn't that much bodywork to the back end, which means that compared to, again, the Japanese rivals, this car does look a little bit squatter and a little bit more stable on the road, especially when you see it moving about. As you move further down, there is a faux diffuser and a pair of faux tailpipes, because like many other cars in this segment, the exhausts in these are fake. However, the actual exhaust lives down there, but the boot space is of particular note because in addition to a spring-loaded tail, which I do quite like because it makes loading a lot easier, this boot is very, very large. It's quite deep, it's quite wide, and the space is relatively usable. There is a pretty decent lip here, about that thick, but that should prevent things from rolling in and out. But mercifully, the lip over the bumper is not that thick, which means that you're not really at risk of scuffing it as you move things in and out. There is a bit more space underneath the boot floor because this car has no spare tire. In its place, you will find a tire inflator kit, as well as a patch kit should there be a nail or something in your tires. But what I find a bit notable, for the wrong reasons, is the fact that the rear seats only fold as a single piece. They are not split 60-40 as you would normally find within this segment, as you'd normally find in a modern car, which I think is a little bit unfortunate. However, closing the tailgate again reveals this car's nice back end. So focus on this bit. This is nice. Now, the interior of the MG5 certainly looks very interesting because in terms of the materials, in terms of the textures, everything in here looks like a relatively upmarket cabin. You've got this prism-like thing going on here. You've got this brushed-like aluminium type trim here. You've got more interesting materials here which stretch onto the door cards. Again, it looks nice, right? Now, as you move further down, that's where you'll find the upholstery in this car, which uses faux leather as standard, with this black faux leather down here, red contrast stitching, as well as a hexagonal pattern up here on the shoulder rest, replete with a little red stripe. And that red stripe also continues here onto the door cards, where you find, again, more of that hexagonal pattern, and more of that contrast stitching down here, where you actually rest your arms. And so, overall, things seem to be quite nice. Sat here the way I normally do, both of my elbows are rested against soft touch materials, and the steering wheel also is leather wrapped with more contrast stitching and these perforations here where you're bound to hold it, and so that certainly looks like good attention to detail. Now, I say that because the way they've paid attention to those details takes away from the fact that upon closer inspection, this cabin is not the highest quality in the world. For example, the dash top is very harsh. The door cards are also hard plastic. The center console is more hard plastic. In fact, even on the door cards themselves, just above that red stripe is more hard plastic. So again, it's a good thing that what you touch feels nice, because what you don't touch doesn't feel nice. Although you could say that that's just, again, good attention to detail. Now, moving further down, we get this central infotainment display, which controls the majority of your car's functions. This also comes with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, but it is wired, which means that you need one of these sticking out through the center console, which is not that great of a look. You'll find another USB-A port up front for charging, as well as a 12-volt socket. This pad here does nothing. This is just a spot for you to put the key if your battery is low, or perhaps to put other random items, because there is no wireless charging pad there. Moving further down, you get your gear selector, whatever, that's all fine. And then you get a decently sized center console here with a surprisingly chunky lid. Anyway, I digress. Going back to this screen, now it's not the largest in the world, but I think that this is certainly a wider display than what you get from both the Honda City and the Toyota Vios. And given the fact that it displays your Android Auto in widescreen, I think this is a perfectly acceptable system. In terms of the response times, it's not that great. This might seem very snappy to you, but that's because the car is currently in a good mood, because when it's not, this can be surprisingly laggard. Now, more irritatingly is the fact that if you have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto running, it takes away a very critical function that you might want to use quite frequently, because unlike the Honda City and the Toyota Vios and also the Proton S70, all of this car's HVAC controls live in the screen. You have a shortcut button here, but all that does is bring up the HVAC menu, which it does take its time with displaying. And when you do, that also reveals the fact that this car does not come with climate control. Instead, it's just regular air conditioning. Now, I mention this because having the HVAC controls in the screen is already one problem. But when you have climate control, it's easy to just set the temperature that you want, set it on automatic, and then just leave it be. However, when you're using air conditioning, like this car offers, you will find yourself needing to fiddle around with this a lot more often than you normally would. For example, this setting might be fine for when you're driving about in the day, but then suddenly at night it becomes very cold, which means that again you'll have to go back in here and adjust these settings. And the more irritating part is the fact that if you have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto running on this, if you press this, it brings up the menu. Great. If you want to go back to Android Auto, pressing this again doesn't dismiss it. Instead, you have to go home and then press your Android Auto Apple CarPlay icon. Not great. It gets even worse when you're trying to trigger this car's 360-degree camera, because while it is certainly there, and of course, if you were to indicate, it does show little feeds from the left and right for reasons I can't fully comprehend. But if you want the 360 camera on, you have to go back to the home screen like this, swipe, and then hit the 360-degree button. As if there wasn't space for a button here, perhaps? But whatever. Now going into this is also another sore point for me, because the camera quality in this is really not great. Yes, I understand this is an 87,000 ringgit car, and so therefore I shouldn't be expecting the moon. In fact, even the S70 up until very recently had rather crap cameras. But this is pretty laughable, because even if you look at the 3D rendering of this car, it looks shocking. Frankly, I don't know what car they're trying to emulate here, but that certainly doesn't look like an MG5, that's for sure. Now, beyond that, there is another screen in this car, and that's here. Now, this central driving display is flanked by a couple of digital numbers, one side for your speed and the other for your RPM. That's great. However, the amount of real estate covered by this screen looks promising until you realize it doesn't really use that space very effectively. Because, for example, if you just have your trip computer running, you just have a single line of text, and then underneath is just a photograph of the car. I know what the car looks like. Thank you very much. And of course, as you move into the menus and so on, sure, you have more things to look at and whatever, but it just feels like this screen could have been better used. For example, instead of having my fuel gauge in like this tiny little icon, they could have been in the screen, right? Or they could have put those gauges larger and then put the speedo and the tacho in the screen. But they didn't do that either. And it's not like this car has ADAS to show off there either. Instead, when you turn on the cruise control, it just comes out a little icon up there. That's it. If I had adaptive cruise control, for example, it'd be nice to be able to see and make sure that the car can see the vehicle in front of me, for example, or the lines on the road, if I had lane centering assist. But I have none of those things, so what's the point? Now, moving beyond that, we do have indicator stalks, that's nice. You have physical controls to the mirrors, also surprisingly nice. And overall, I can say at least that the buttons in here do feel decently high quality. Like all the buttons and switches that you touch in here do feel of a decent quality. The same goes for the steering wheel, although again, the steering wheel does look like a design that was nicked from Volkswagen in about the mid-2010s, because the design looks very familiar, but at least you have that MG badge there. Now, aside from that, in terms of practicality, again, you've got a couple of cup holders here, decently sized center console bin, decently sized door bins, big enough for at least a half-size bottle, and of course there's a 6-speaker audio system in here as well. So that's all fine, I guess. But rear cabin space is certainly this car's party piece, because with the front seats that are in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, as you can see, I have a good amount of knee room, although headroom comes at a little bit of a premium. And because this car hasn't been or the packaging rather, isn't trying to make this car seem larger than it is, I do have very good under-thigh support, and I can tuck my feet underneath the seat in front of me, which means sat here, I am surprisingly comfortable. This rear seat angle is also not too upright, which means that I can sit back here for several hours, as I have when I test drove this car all the way to Desaru as part of a media drive. And so life back here is really not that bad in terms of space, and the fact this car comes with a sunroof also means that this black interior doesn't feel like it's too dark in here. That's always nice. Now, I do have a centrally mounted crotch cooler here, although there is only one vent, which means that if you have two passengers back here, then you'll just have to fight for it. You have a single USB-A port, a small cubby underneath, decently sized door bins big enough for a liter size bottle, and a decently large upper bin here, which should be large enough to hold a phone. There are pockets behind the front seats, but there is no center armrest. And I do think that they've missed a trick by not offering a center armrest, because that would have made life back here even more comfortable for just 2 rear passengers. Now, if you do want to have a central passenger in the middle, this seat base is surprisingly wide, and while there is a decently pronounced bump in the floor, there is enough footroom for 3 passengers abreast back here. And of course, if you're trying to fit child seats, that's even easier because your ISOFIX mounts are relatively easy to locate, and because of this car's relatively long wheelbase, it should mean that a bulky rear-facing child seat should not be a problem either. And of course, even if you have booster seats for slightly older children, the sill on this car is not that high, which means that they should have a pretty good view out, and I do have a pretty good view out right in front of me as well. But this is all a matter of perception, because ultimately this is meant to be a B segment car hiding underneath a C segment body, and so space and stuff like that isn't really that much of a surprise. What has the potential to surprise, however, is the way this car drives, especially with that Brit Dynamics badge on the back, whatever that's supposed to mean. Now, driving the MG5 requires an adjustment in terms of your expectations, because I feel that when you walk up to this car, when you first look at it in a showroom, for example, it does seem to promise much. It's a large car, it's got a dependable powertrain, there's lots of space inside, and so you have a certain perception of a vehicle like this. However, when you remember, or when you're forced to remember, the fact this is a sub 90,000 ringgit vehicle, and ultimately it is competing against, again, the likes of the Toyota Vios and the Honda City, if your expectations are there, then this car is about fine. Because from the moment you set off, you will feel the fact this powertrain is decently responsive, but it is responsive when gauged against other cars in this category. Which means that this throttle pedal, for example, is decently responsive for another B segment saloon like this. It picks up speed with a certain degree of alacrity, yes, but provided that you provide enough throttle input. But when you turn the wheel, that's where I think this car tends to shine, because the weighting of the steering wheel feels very, very natural. It doesn't feel overly weighted, it doesn't feel too light, which is something that Chinese cars tend to get quite wrong. And so the fact that this car feels as natural as it does means that, again, this is something that promises much. And as the roads begin to twist and the turns begin to set on, plus when you're carrying a bit of speed, that's where this car's very well-tuned suspension also comes into play, because the body lean in this car has not been eliminated. This is not that kind of car. Instead, it's been very nicely balanced to provide a very natural lean. And so it feels, again, to the driver like a very natural experience. It feels like a car that's very predictable to live with, which is precisely what you want. Now, at higher speed, like on the motorway, for example, that same very well tuned and well-calibrated suspension setup means that, again, you are able to carry speed through corners and carry speed on the motorway in a manner that feels very confidence-inspiring. This feels like the sort of car that will remain stable even at higher speed, and based on my testing to Desaru and back, that certainly seems to be the case. Furthermore, because the suspension on this car is not overly soft nor overly stiff, it means that traveling great distances does feel very comfortable for passengers. It doesn't isolate you from the world the way, say, an older Toyota Vios would, for example, or at least try to. Instead, this car provides enough feedback and reaction to the driver so that from the driver's seat, you always know what's going on. And that's kind of, again, what you want from a car like this. However, in terms of refinement, that's not so great in the MG5. Now, the Maxxis tires may have something to do with it, but it does feel like this car does kick up quite a noticeable amount of road noise. And when you do start to cruise at very high speeds, like for example, at the motorway speed limit or beyond, that's when wind noise starts to make itself a little bit more apparent, usually kind of around here. Now, they've tried to reduce the amount of wind noise kicked up by the A-pillars by reprofiling the mirrors in order to smooth airflow over them, and I do think that that has helped somewhat. But this is not the quietest car at that speed, but then again, you'd be hard-pressed to find another vehicle within this segment and at this price point that will do better. Only the Proton S70 stands out, but then again, Proton was benchmarking C-segment saloons for that car, whereas this car very clearly benchmarks B-segment cars. And so naturally, the expectations have to be set based on the vehicles that they benchmark and not necessarily the overall dimensions of the car that we're looking at. And now comes the rather sensitive matter of safety, because the MG5 is not really keeping to the playbook of other Chinese car makers where they try to load as much tech and kit into it as possible. This car comes with blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, it even comes with lane departure warning, apparently, not that I've seen it work once while I've had it, but that's it. There is no adaptive cruise control, no traffic jam assist, no AEB for that matter. Even the high beams don't offer an automatic mode. Instead, that is something that you have to do yourself. And so it doesn't feel like this car is particularly pushing towards trying to be an everything car to all people, the way other Chinese manufacturers have tried to offer maximum value at minimum price. Instead, this car feels like a very careful balance by spending the money in places where it will matter over the long run. Because it's nice to have a big screen and a fancy audio system and blah, blah, blah. That sort of stuff is all well and good. But ultimately, what you want from a car, especially something within this price point where buyers tend to hold on to their cars for a little bit longer, like 7 to 9 years, you want a car that feels reliable. You want a car where the car maker has spent a considerable amount of money on the engineering. And as far as I'm concerned, driving this car around, it does feel like this car is relatively well engineered. The complexity of the suspension, the deftness of the ride tuning in this car, the way the driving dynamics seem to work with this car, that all tells me, or informs me at least, that this is a car that has been engineered well. The bones of this car are good, even if the rest of it might not necessarily be up to scratch. Now, bear in mind, I'm only saying this because Chinese car makers, again, have now a reputation for punching above their weight, for essentially selling loss leaders more than anything else, whereas this feels like the sort of car made by the sort of company that understands that ultimately this is a business, not a charity. Some car makers will go above and beyond to stick high quality materials and all the technology that you can fit into a car and then sell it at a ridiculous price. That might be great for sales figures. It is not great as a business model. And so it does sort of raise the possibility that these cars might not have the longevity, one, and two, the brands themselves might not have the longevity to stick around, which then leads to the idea or the thought process of, if I buy this car now, will the brand still be here in 5 to 7 years if I need a warranty claim, for example, or spare parts? Whereas in this car, that doesn't really seem to be the case, because again, the money has been spent where it matters most. There are some niceties, yes, for example, like the electric driver's seat, which comes with lumbar, which is nice because most B segment cars don't offer lumbar. Some C segment cars don't offer lumbar. That's nice. The sunroof, that's nice. But aside from that, everything in here just feels like it's very well screwed together, like it's made to last. And the choice of offering this naturally aspirated engine as opposed to a more trendy turbocharged motor with a 7-speed DCT also feels like a very considered choice. They made this in order to ensure that they have a car that will last the test of time, and this car certainly does feel that way. It is just unfortunate, however, that the MG5 doesn't enjoy a 5-star ASEAN NCAP rating the way you would expect, again, a car within this segment to offer. Now, MG has clarified that the previous Australasia NCAP rating, which was particularly foul, was as a result of the car being tested without seatbelt pretensioners, whereas this car does offer them, which is why it went from 0 to 3 very quickly. However, in a swathe of vehicles that offer 5 stars as standard, 3 still feels quite notable and not in a particularly good way. However, given the fact that this car does have very good passive safety, which is, again, in terms of engineering, because the safety cell of this car, for example, is quite strong and should be able to absorb impact quite well. The fact that the passenger safety ratings in this car have favored quite, or rather fared quite strongly and quite well, that should all lead a buyer or potential buyer to believe that this is a safe car. And once you take that into consideration, I do think that given the fact that the majority of buyers nowadays all seem to swing towards a Honda City or a Toyota Vios like as a default choice, like there's nothing else in this segment, or for those looking for something larger, they end up in a Proton S70, I do think that the MG5 exists for a reason. This is a left field choice for left field buyers. The fact that you can buy this car in a bright red and a bright yellow should tell you enough. This is not a car for wallflowers. This is not a car for people who follow the crowd. This is for everyone else. And I think that for a car that stands out, or rather is being designed to stand out primarily, I do think that this car fares quite well. It's decently comfortable, it's decent to drive, the suspension is very well tuned, the interior is as refined as you'd expect from a car in this segment, and more importantly, the safety features in this car should be adequate for the way the majority of Malaysians use them. Sure, it would have been nice to have some more stuff, but then this car would have been significantly more expensive, especially given the fact this car is fully imported from Thailand. And so I do think that in that balance of trying to offer more space for less money, I think that SAIC Motors Malaysia has done a very delicate balancing act, and I think they've done decently well by specifying this car the way they have. But of course, if you want a car that balances even better still and offers perhaps a little bit more practicality in terms of the overall versatility of the space, there is of course the Toyota Vios, which is a car that we rate very highly. And of course, you can get those with funky financing plans thanks to Toyota Credit. And of course, if you want something that's even more powerful, for example, should you be driving over longer distances more frequently and therefore you need something with a little bit more firepower, then of course the Proton S70 is always there. That car's 3-cylinder turbocharged powertrain should offer a little bit more torque and slightly more refined cruising manners. And of course, that car does offer a little bit more in terms of active safety features if that's something that's important to you. However, if standing out is something that matters to you, and I know that it does to quite a few people, whether or not they're willing to admit it, then I know why you're watching this review. The MG5 is not a bad car, especially for the money. And given the fact that you are very unlikely to see another one in the corporate car park, this car might just be what you're looking for. In any case, that concludes our review of the 2025 MG5. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe and jangan bodoh.